There are defining moments of every generation. Wars breaking out or ending, men walking on a celestial object, assassinations, and even recently, pandemics. But every once in a while, one of these defining moments kicks off a new era. The reverberations of that moment will be felt for years or even decades. And for Gen X, that defining moment came on the morning of September 11th, 2001.
Good morning, America. I'm Charles Gibson.
I'm Diane Sawyer, and it's Tuesday, September 11th, 2001.
Other than that, it's kind of quiet around the country. We like quiet. It's quiet. It's too quiet.
It is beautiful outside. Perfect September day with lots of sunshine. Oh, would you look at Washington, huh? I'm going outside today.
The day itself was nothing special. While the coming events were something that would have everyone's eyes in the skies, the day started out with everyone watching the ocean. Spinning up just off the state of Pennsylvania, Hurricane Erin was rumored to hit the state of New York, and meteorologists were keeping a keen eye on it. Rain had passed through the day prior on the 10th, but the 11th started out crystal clear with a cool temp of 65 degrees. The morning news was well underway, and the day just seemed like any other Tuesday. Then at 7:59 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11, a 767 carrying 81 passengers and 11 crew, departed from Logan International Airport in Boston. At 8:14, United Airlines 175, another 767 from Boston, takes off with 56 passengers and 9 crew. And at the same time that plane was taking off, 5 hijackers took over Flight 11 in midair. At 8:20, American Airlines Flight 77, a 757, takes off from Washington Dulles International Airport, carrying 58 passengers and 6 crew. And at 8:42, United Airlines Flight 93, another 757, takes off from Newark with 37 passengers and 7 crew. Then, sometime between 8:42 and 8:46, Flight 175 was hijacked over New Jersey with 5 attackers on board. Both Flight 77 and 93 veer off towards the Pentagon and most likely the White House for the latter plane. That flight was overwhelmed by passengers and ended up crashing into a field in Pennsylvania. The other 2 planes, though, were going for more of a televised event. At 8:46, while Flight 175 was being hijacked, the first plane flew into the side of the North Tower in New York City. But despite how crazy that last statement is, while it was a massive event, the world wasn't quite standing still yet. For many in New York, they may have heard the boom or perhaps even felt it, but the confusion at the time was not quite panic yet.
What the hell was that?
It sounded like a plane crash.
Hey, Beth. What is that?
And that's because, realistically, no one really knew what happened except for the select few that actually watched it happen, which meant people just kept going on about their lives, including many people who were working in the very building that got hit by the plane. Many of the morning news channels started getting reports of an explosion at the World Trade Center and began covering the story with speculation and surprise.
We want to tell you what we know as we know it. We just got a report in that there's been some sort of explosion at the World Trade Center in New York City.
Remember, the idea of an aircraft hitting the building was far-fetched and wasn't overly leaned on as a plausible theory, at least not for the next 34 minutes. Then at 9:03, as cameras rolled footage of the towers to document the previous impact, another plane shot into frame. And before millions of eyes, there was no doubt.
It does not appear that there's any kind of an effort up there yet. Now remember, oh my God.
Oh my God.
That looks like a second plane.
And as Flight 175 crushed into the south side of the South Tower, all hell broke loose. And for the foreseeable future, it was a media circus. A world watched on loop as a plane full of people exploded through a building. Cameras documented as people chose a free fall over flames. And at 1 minute before 10 a.m., the world witnessed firsthand mass murder live on their TVs as the South Building collapses just 56 minutes after the impact of Flight 175.
It's a very haunting description that Bob Kerr just gave of that low-flying aircraft near the White House, and one can only wonder if that was something that ultimately ended up in the Pentagon.
We just saw a live picture of what seemed to be a portion of the building falling away.
Within half an hour, the North Tower buckled under its own weight as well and came down at 10:28 a.m.
And there's, you can see, perhaps the second tower, the front tower, the top portion of which is collapsing. Good Lord. There are no words.
Just 2.5 hours after the first plane left Boston, the Twin Towers were reduced to a blanket of rubble, and in total, 2,996 people lost their lives in that. And whether or not we knew it at the time, our world had significantly changed, and the word terrorism was on everyone's lips. Now, before we look at how 9/11 changed the media landscape, we should look at the cause of that day. The word terrorist comes from the French Revolution around 1794. At first, it was used as an abusive term for someone who holds a political opinion that differs from the norm. Over the years, it has gone through some changes, and in the early 80s, it started to take its current form. Now, terrorism is defined as premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents, usually intended to influence an audience. Now, that might seem like a pretty stale description, but it does nail it rather accurately. There is one problem, though. What we were looking at in those days was less political motivation and more religious motivation, which did seem to scare people more. The idea of someone doing something for a political motive is a lot easier to swallow than someone driven by scriptures. And while this might sound wild and somewhat sensational, back in the 1980s, the political ideology of terrorism wasn't totally dismissed. In fact, in an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation called The High Ground, the crew of the Enterprise actually struggled with the morals of such a thing.
And it appears that terrorism is an effective way to promote political change.
Yes, it can be.
It aired in 1990, almost 12 years before the attacks on the World Trade Center, and has since been banned in several countries. And considering it shines a semi-sympathetic light on rebel fighters and terrorism, you can kind of see why. It is a fascinating clip to watch and in some ways kind of eerie. I'll link it below if you want to check it out for yourself. So that is an obvious instance where 9/11 impacted the media, perhaps in a roundabout way. But it has been more blatant in other areas. Newsrooms went through massive overhauls in the years following the attacks. Old school newsrooms had the adage, if it bleeds, it leads, which, put simply, meant that violence was used to grab the viewer. Photos and videos were widely used when discussing crimes, and there was little thought to the impact it might have. A great example of this would be the death of R. Bud Dwyer in 1987, who took his own life during a press conference. Those final moments still exist on video to this day and were played on loop across many stations. There were just no rules in a lot of news departments pre-9/11. And the reasoning behind that was actually quite solid. In the safety of our living rooms, we were desensitized to the mayhem. We were used to seeing war zones and all other kinds of hell that wasn't on our doorstep. There was little fear of societal impact in feeding us those images. Even when it was in our own backyard, it was nothing that we were emotionally connected to. Think of the Challenger exploding over and over for days, weeks, months, even years after it happened. Those that died just became another part of the tragedy, but none of us were intrinsically linked to those people. But as the planes flew into the buildings on that sunny Tuesday morning, news crews were anxious to show us every angle, every blurry jumper, and every split second of the towers crumbling. And this was no Challenger. This was no JFK assassination. This was televised mass murder. And it was on repeat. But most people didn't realize how intrinsically linked people were to that moment. You see, for the Western mind, this was unthinkable. Up to that point, our world was safe. People didn't worry about terrorism on their way to work. People didn't see their countrymen dying in droves on the morning news. That was for other countries. And despite this happening in New York and Virginia, this was as local as it could get for everyone. And when that sense of safety broke for many in North America, those images became a lot more than distressing. Some started to realize it might actually cause trauma, especially in children. And while it took the news departments some time to realize this, things inevitably began to change, which meant there had to be new rules developed to protect viewers from sensitive material that may scare or otherwise traumatize them. And now, in an era where we have constant stream of videos in every emergency, shockingly, our news is tamed down. We see less and less actual carnage, and news companies are always quick to point out that the images may not be suitable for sensitive viewers. What about the music, though? Now, we all know the stories about the Clear Channel memorandum that went out shortly after the attacks. And if you haven't heard about it, it's a list of 165 suggested songs that should be dropped from airplay due to the sensitive nature of the times. Now, this is nothing new, and it's been happening for decades. For example, Michael Jackson was pulled from radio play multiple times as different stories emerged, only to pop up a few years later, especially after his death. But the Clear Channel memorandum was a bit different. Music was considered to be one of the sacred things to distract us. So this list went out and was aimed at not traumatizing an already hurt world. And it did contain lots of music that was a no-brainer, like The Animals' We Gotta Get Out of This Place, and ELO's Fire on High. But other songs were a bit more confusing, like The Bangles' Walk Like an Egyptian and Green Day's Brain Stew, just to name a few. But the list had more of an impact than just what songs were playing on the radio. Several artists who had close ties to Clear Channel were blocked from speaking out about 9/11. You see, it was a very divisive time, and how the whole ordeal was handled has even survived this long to become a meme. And for many bands, the fear spread that Clear Channel would drop artists from big events, or just in general if they didn't follow the corporate rules. And music was big business, and at the time, radio was still one of the biggest providers of revenue. But the memorandum even had an impact on the direction of music. You see, the list was mostly rock, and some bands seemed to be targeted for no other reason than being, well, distasteful. Rage Against the Machine was one of those bands, and their whole catalog got blacklisted. Now, they were already on a downward spiral and were in the stages of a breakup, so it kind of just seemed to hasten the inevitable. But this is where the sinister edges of that memorandum kick in, and we can kind of see the possible tendrils of government censorship. You see, if you know anything about Rage, their lyrics, though dark, had nothing to do with anything that went on that morning. But they did question government, specifically government control. They used words like guerrilla, and any sniff of destabilization was completely squashed by this memorandum, which has led to a lot of people wondering exactly who put the list out, and specifically, who curated it. But it wasn't just a bad time to be a well-established rock band either. It was also a brutal time to be breaking into the scene. Several bands got stopped in their tracks by 9/11 due to the obvious shutdown, but also the unwillingness to put up with edgy lyrics. Drowning Pool was just that band. Their first big album, called Sinner, was released in June of 2001, and their first single, it was called Bodies. Let's just say that the hook was a bit much for radio. Yeah, you can kind of get that one. Now, to be fair to Drowning Pool, though, there's no way of knowing how much 9/11 impacted their career because their singer died the following year from heart failure. But to make this storyline about music and 9/11 a bit more interesting, as mentioned, September 11th happened on a Tuesday, which was considered the big day to release albums. And it wasn't just any Tuesday. It was Super Tuesday, which was a quarterly point where a bunch of huge names released all their music. This was the big push before Christmas. And on that fateful day, there were some massive albums dropping. Jay-Z dropped Blueprint, widely considered the best rap album of the 2000s. Bob Dylan released Love and Theft. And then there was Slayer. They released an album called God Hates Us All. Now, because there was a lot of music being released around 9/11, there was also artists that were going out of their way to make sure their music didn't offend. Several bands switched out cover art, some for barely noticeable themes, and some were a bit more egregious. The rap duo The Coup was one such band. Their album called Party Music was slated for release on November 6th, and the album, it had art featuring the members standing in front of the World Trade Center while it was exploding. That is poor timing. Some bands decided to remove songs from their albums, others changed lyrics or album names. Bush was planning on releasing Golden State with an album cover depicting a plane flying in the sky. And to make things more awkward, the first single was going to be called Speed Kills. They ended up renaming the song The People That We Love. And a lot of conspiracy theorists believe this was the influence of corporate America shining through, much like the Clear Channel memorandum. This has been downplayed many times, but there's one incident that does look pretty damning. Jimmy Eat World's album Bleed America came out that year. And well, the naming of the album is quite awkward to say the least. It was changed to just a simply self-titled album, and rather quietly, I might add. But then what does that prove? Well, the album was released in June of 2001, meaning to change it, they went through the whole process of re-releasing it, which wouldn't have been that big of an issue on an album that wasn't getting much traction, but that one was huge. Now, of course, it could have just been the band reading the temperature of the world and reacting to it, or perhaps there was a bit of a conspiracy of corporations that were receiving pressure from higher ups. A lot of questions still linger, especially considering Jimmy Eat World seemed to sputter in the grand scheme of popularity after that. All right, then, before we go, a bunch of other little bits and bytes remaining. Movies had a tough time in the days following 9/11. Multiple films had to scramble to remove the towers from their writing or even production. Spider-Man had a whole scene removed that showed a helicopter being trapped by webs between the two towers. A scene was later added that showed Spider-Man holding onto a flagpole with a large American flag as a response to the attack. Some movies flat out removed the towers digitally. Men in Black 2 had to have their whole story rewritten, all because it was supposed to come to a climax at the top of the towers. But even with all that, there were also changes made to older movies as well. When Armageddon premiered on ABC in 2002, there were shots of the World Trade Center being hit by meteors and catching on fire. That scene didn't make it to air. And in Home Alone 2, there is a scene at the top of the towers. That was also cut out before being aired. And lastly, well, there were no TV or radio stations that were physically in the World Trade Center. There were several that broadcast from the towers. And as you can imagine, there were massive interruptions of service from those stations after the attack. Sadly, though, there were 6 engineers that did lose their lives that day, all of which were trying their best to maintain the signals of the stations during the attacks. Thanks for watching.